Chuck Berry wrote the language of rock and roll and spent a lifetime being judged in a language that was never designed to forgive him. What do we do with a man whose music built youth and whose life kept colliding with the law? On the afternoon of March 18, 2017, a house near Wentzville sat in a Missouri quiet that felt almost staged. Wide sky, bare branches, the kind of stillness that makes even ordinary sounds seem like evidence. Inside, the air carried the faint ghosts of a working life. Old paper, old wood, old metal strings, and whatever scent clings to amplifiers that have spent decades warming up and cooling down. Somewhere in that house, a guitar rested the way a tool rests when the job is never really finished. A call went out. First responders arrived. A legend, the headlines would soon say, had been found unresponsive. The phrase is clinical, almost gentle. Unresponsive, as if the body simply refused to answer a question. There was talk of cardiac arrest, of time slipping away in minutes that are never enough. And then a physician pronounced what the world always pretends it is prepared to hear. Chuck Berry was gone, 90 years old. A number that sounds like triumph until you remember that triumph, in this story, was never simple. Because even at 90, even at the end of a long road, the name carried two weights at once. The man who turned teenage life into myth, and the man who kept getting dragged back into files, dates, charges, and the cold language of the law. When the news hit, it moved the way his riffs used to move. Fast, catchy, impossible to ignore. Phones lit up in pockets, screens filled with the same compressed sentence, the same shortcut of remembrance. People shared songs like candles. They posted the duck walk as proof they had been there, somehow, at the beginning. And then, almost immediately, the argument arrived with the morning. Not about whether he mattered, everyone knew he mattered, but about what? Exactly. His meaning was allowed to be a pioneer, a genius, a difficult man, a man with a record, a man with a record. Somewhere in memory, a courtroom gavel falls, hard, final, indifferent. And then the opening lick rises again, bright and insolent, as if music can outrun a verdict once it has been spoken. How many times did his life swing between those two sounds, the crack of authority and the rush of a guitar line that promised motion? One of those lines. Johnny B. Goode was sent into space on the Voyager Golden Record, an Immortal postcard, a 3-minute portrait of American youth hurtling toward a destination that will never answer back. What kind of eternity is that? Your sound traveling beyond the solar system while your biography stays trapped on Earth, reviewed and rejudged like evidence. He sold youth its freedom while his own life kept getting audited, sentenced, and reduced. And if rock and roll was built to feel like escape, why does his story read so often like containment? To understand how the world learned to chant his riffs like scripture, it helps to return to the city that raised him, St. Louis, Missouri, where motion and surveillance have always shared the same streets. He was born Charles Edward Anderson Berry on October 18, 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri, a city that knows how to hold two truths at the same time. It can be proud and brutal in the same breath. It can carry church music through the air while the streets below negotiate their own rules. In the North Side neighborhood known as the Ville, black middle-class life had carved out a pocket of aspiration and discipline under the weight of segregation. Families built respectability like a shield because they had learned that a polished surface might be the only armor the world would recognize. Berry grew up with that dual instruction, behave and survive. His father was a deacon. His mother was ambitious in the way working families must be ambitious. The church offered structure, a place where a boy could learn how sound carries, how a voice can change a room, how a rhythm can turn chaos into order. But St. Louis offered other lessons too, lessons written in streetlight and impatience. By his teens, Barry was already drawn to the spectacle of music. The guitar was not just an instrument, it was a way of claiming space. He watched players who could turn a simple phrase into a threat and a flirtation at once. He listened to blues, to country, to the swing and jump that moved bodies before it moved minds. He also absorbed the early post-war American obsession with motion, cars, travel, speed, the sense that if you moved fast enough you could outrun whatever the world had decided you were. But youth does not only produce dreams. Sometimes it produces accidents. Sometimes it produces crimes. In 1944, before he could even finish high school, Barry was arrested and convicted for armed robbery in a carjacking episode with friends. The details have been told in different tones over the years. Some versions turn it into a cautionary tale, others into a footnote. But the shape of it remains. A young man, a weapon, a stolen car, a sudden collision with the system. He was sent to a reformatory, and he spent crucial years behind walls when most boys are learning how to become men in open air. What does a teenage mind do with confinement? Does it harden? Does it sharpen? Does it begin to fantasize about escape so vividly that escape becomes the only story worth telling? When Barry later wrote songs about running, about driving, about no particular place to go, was he simply capturing teenage freedom? Or was he writing the opposite of what he had lived? Like a man drawing sunlight because he knows the feeling of a cell. Released in 1947, he returned to a world that had kept moving without him. He married Thelmetta Toddy Suggs, started a family, and took work wherever work would hold. Factory jobs, odd jobs, the practical grind of a man trying to build a stable life with unstable tools. He also learned to cut hair, a trade that sounds almost symbolic, hands shaping appearances, controlling what the world sees. At night. Though, the other life waited. Clubs, small stages, the kind of rooms where a guitarist can learn faster than any teacher could instruct. Barry began playing with local musicians, including the pianist Johnny Johnson, whose boogie and swing would become a crucial engine for Barry's future sound. There, in the smoke and laughter, he practiced the art he would later perfect, taking a piece of everyday life and turning it into a hook you could not forget. Still, the past doesn't leave easily. A reform school record sits in the background like a stain the light can't entirely bleach out. For a black man in mid-century America, the law was never only law, it was also a spotlight that could swing toward you at any time. Could Barry feel that? Even then, the sense that the system would always be ready to define him by his worst moment? And if you know the world is waiting to reduce you, does that make you cling harder to control, to ownership, to the idea that your story must be told by you before someone else tells it for you? Long before the duck walk became a logo, long before the riffs became scripture, the boy from St. Louis was already learning the oldest American lesson. Freedom is a dream you must write yourself, because the world will not hand it to you kindly. The early 1950s did not hand Chuck Berry a clear path. They handed him a crowded room of sounds and the pressure to choose a voice that could cut through them. St. Louis clubs were full of talent and competition, blues players who could make a single note feel like a confession, jazz musicians who treated rhythm like architecture, country tunes drifting in from radios that didn't care about neighborhood lines. Barry watched it all with a craftsman's focus. He wasn't only trying to play well, he was trying to create a template. He learned from T-Bone Walker's showmanship how a guitarist can be a front man without apologizing. He learned from the blues how to tell the truth in code. He learned from country music how to keep the story moving. And he learned from the audience, which is often the harshest teacher. If the people are talking, you are being ignored. If they lean forward, you are alive. What he began to chase was not virtuosity for its own sake. It was clarity, a riff you could whistle, a beat you could drive to, a lyric that sounded like something a teenager might actually say with the window cracked and the night still young. That pursuit led him north, to Chicago, where the music business felt less like a local hustle and more like a machine with teeth. In Chicago, blues was not just emotion, it was an industry. And at the center of that industry was Chess Records, a label that recorded Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and other architects of electric blues. Barry arrived like an ambitious outsider with a suitcase of ideas, looking for a door that would open. The story goes that he found Muddy Waters and played him what he had. Waters listened, then directed him to Leonard Chess. It sounds like a myth because it is too clean, one master pointing to the next step. But myths form around moments that feel inevitable in hindsight. Barry got an audition, and in 1955 he walked into a recording session that would change the shape of popular music. He had a song that began as a country tune, Ida Red, but Barry wasn't interested in leaving it where it came from. He rewired it. He sped it up, sharpened it, gave it a backbeat that felt like a car engine kicking into gear. Maybelline came out of that session and climbed the charts, crossing boundaries that the country itself still insisted on maintaining. It sold because it sounded like America's private desire to move, to chase, to outpace the rules. Success, at first, looks like a door opening. Then it reveals itself as a corridor. Barry toured hard. He wrote fast. He performed with the intensity of a man who knows that opportunities for black artists could be brief, conditional, and fragile. Each new song was another piece of evidence that he wasn't a fluke. Roll Over Beethoven, School Day, Rock and Roll Music, Sweet Little 16, Johnny B. Goode. The titles themselves sound like chapters in a new language lesson. But behind the public rise, the private pressure multiplied. Touring meant long nights, unfamiliar towns, hotels that sometimes wouldn't take him, promoters who sometimes didn't want to pay, audiences that could adore the music while still resenting the man. How do you carry that contradiction without growing suspicious of everyone who smiles at you? Barry's genius wasn't only the riffs. It was the way he wrote about ordinary detail, carburetors, classroom boredom, dance floors, neon signs, and made those details feel like mythology. He turned post-war consumer culture into poetry and turned teenage life into a form of drama that adults could pretend not to understand. His diction was precise. His humor was sharp. His characters were vivid. The boy with the guitar, the girl with the attitude, the driver with nowhere to be and everything to prove. And in the middle of it all was a practical mind that never forgot what the streets had taught him. Barry paid attention to contracts. He watched credits. He listened for the moment a handshake becomes a trap. He had already lost years to the system once. He wasn't eager to lose his songs to it, too. In hotel rooms after shows, he would sit with a notebook and a guitar, testing phrases the way a mechanic tests an engine. A line had to fit the mouth. A rhyme had to feel inevitable, not clever. He could turn a simple detail, an engine motoring, a classroom ringing, into a shot of cinema. Even the stage moves were engineered. The duck walk did not happen by accident. It was a physical signature, a way of saying, without words, that this music belonged to a body that refused to stand still. Still, the machine was bigger than him. Chess Records could amplify him, but it could also own pieces of the story. Touring could make him famous, but it could also make him tired in a way that sleep doesn't cure. Fame could make him rich, but it could also make him visible. And visibility in America has always been complicated for black men who refuse to stay in their assigned lanes. In offices where music was measured in categories, someone would eventually ask the question that turns art into a shelf. So what is Chuck Berry exactly? Rhythm and blues, country, novelty, teen pop? He could answer with a grin and a riff, but the question itself carried a warning. If you let other people name you, other people get to sell you, and then they get to blame you when the story breaks. Was the creation of rock and roll an act of liberation? Or was it also the moment Berry stepped into a spotlight that would later make every mistake impossible to hide? He wrote about highways like they were freedom. Yet even in those early years, another road was forming beneath the music. The road toward scrutiny, toward law, toward a life where the soundtrack would never fully drown out the sound of judgment. By 1958, Chuck Berry's songs had become a kind of national weather. You could feel them in diners and living rooms, in jukeboxes glowing like small altars, in teenagers learning how to hold their bodies to a backbeat. His guitar tone was bright and insistent, a bell you couldn't ignore. His lyrics were even more revolutionary. He didn't sing about abstract longing the way some pop music did. He sang about the stuff on the street: cars, school, money, jobs, flirting, trouble. In 3 minutes, he could write a short story with a beginning, a twist, and a punchline. This was the secret. He made rock and roll literate without making it polite. He wrote sentences you could picture. He turned teenage slang into art. And he did it with a smile that looked easy until you studied it longer and saw the steel behind it. On stage, he looked like a man who had invented his own gravity. The duck walk was a dare. The grin was a challenge. The suit, sharp, sometimes loud, announced that he refused to be small. The crowd screamed, and for a few minutes the country's rules loosened. A black man stood in the center of a cultural storm, and teenagers of every color moved to his command. That alone would have been enough to make him dangerous to the old order. The records piled up, the tours stretched out. He tried to build anchors in the chaos. Back in St. Louis, he invested in places that could feel like home, nightclubs, ventures that promised control in a business built on other people's control. He could stand on a stage he owned and decide who got paid, who got in, what time the show started. Yet even ownership has limits when the world outside the door is still America. A venue can be yours and still be watched. In the middle of a tour, there were nights when the glamour cracked, a promoter would stall on payment, a hotel desk would suddenly have no rooms. A police car would linger too long in the parking lot, as if fame itself were a suspicious activity. Berry would smile because a smile is sometimes the safest weapon, but the tension traveled with him like a second instrument case. His name circulated alongside a new word that felt like a door being kicked open: rock and roll. Critics and elders argued about whether the music was trash or prophecy. But the kids didn't wait for permission. They took the songs and built their identities around them. Yet a public image is a costume you cannot take off. Berry's song sold freedom, and the audience bought the idea that the man himself must be free. But what did freedom look like at the end of a long night when the stage lights went dark? Did he return to a quiet room and feel relief? Or did the silence feel like abandonment? He was a storyteller, but the story he told was not always the story he lived. In Sweet Little 16, the road is an invitation in real life. The road was also exhaustion. In School Day, boredom is a joke. In real life, boredom could be replaced by danger in a single bad decision. In Johnny B. Goode, a poor boy with a guitar becomes destiny itself, It is nearly a self-portrait, a coded autobiography in which talent functions like salvation. But if talent is salvation, why does salvation still require so much struggle? Behind the scenes, Barry guarded his work with a suspicion that made some people call him difficult. He was careful with money and credits. He disliked being cheated, and he disliked the feeling that admiration could be another kind of theft. In the studio, he expected precision. On the road, he expected professionalism. He knew that for black artists, the margin between being celebrated and being exploited could be thin as a guitar string. There were also tensions inside his music that most listeners did not hear at first. His songs celebrated consumer culture, cars, radios, dances, but they also hinted at how quickly pleasure turns into pursuit. The characters are always moving, always chasing, always trying to reach something before it disappears. That is what makes the songs feel alive. They are not peaceful. They are kinetic. They are America in motion. In those years, Barry became the blueprint. Future rock stars learned his posture, his pacing, his punchlines. Bands in England, hungry for American sound, studied his records like sacred text. The Rolling Stones would begin their career with Barry covers. The Beatles would absorb his storytelling and his bite. Later, guitarists like Jimi Hendrix would take the language Barry built and stretch it toward new dialects. An entire genre grew from the grammar he wrote. But a blueprint can be lonely. When everyone speaks your language, you can start to feel like the world no longer hears your voice, only your influence. Did Barry feel pride watching the next generation rise? Or did he feel the sharper emotion of being replaced by your own inventions? And what does a living legend do with the fact that legends are expected to be simple? The myth wants a smiling man doing a duck walk forever. The myth wants a clean origin story and a clean moral. The myth does not want complexity. It does not want courtrooms. It does not want the private shadows that follow public light. Barry's fame offered him glamour, television appearances, screaming crowds, the status of a star. But it also offered him a trap, a public that believed it already knew who he was. The more famous he became, the less room he had to be ordinary. Some nights, the contradiction was visible even from the stage. Promoters split crowds, police watched doors, and the same song about teenage freedom could play to a room that still felt organized by rules nobody wanted to name. His duck walk looked playful, almost cartoonish, but it was also a survival move. Motion as disguise, motion as escape, a body refusing to stand still long enough to be pinned down. How long can a man keep moving before the system decides where he is allowed to go? If rock and roll was supposed to be rebellion, who did Barry rebel against in those years? Parents and teachers. Or the deeper American machinery that watched black success with one hand on the applause and the other on the rules? The courtroom is silent in a way a concert never is. There is no backbeat, no laughter, no room to improvise. A gavel can end a future in one motion, and no riff can interrupt a sentence once it is spoken. In that silence, his name stopped being a signature and became a file. In late 1959, at the exact moment Barry's name seemed welded to the idea of American youth, the federal government reached for a different vocabulary. The Mann Act. Immoral purposes, words that sound like stone. The new language did not care how many teenagers knew his choruses. It was not designed to forgive, it was designed to define. In the simplest telling, the story is ugly and straightforward. In the more complicated telling, it is also a story about race, power, and the way American law has historically enjoyed making examples of famous black men. The first trial was vacated after the judge's racist comments were cited as poisoning the process. A second trial ended in conviction. Barry would serve time, about 20 months in federal prison. His career stalled in a way that no riff could repair. What does it feel like to be at the peak of your cultural power and suddenly be reduced to a defendant number? One day you are the soundtrack of teenage rebellion. The next day you are a man in a suit standing before men who can decide your future with a gavel. Did he feel rage, shame, a cold awareness that the country he had entertained was also capable of crushing him without losing sleep? When Barry went in, the world did not pause. Radio moved on. New songs arrived. New stars rose. And when he came out, the industry had shifted. The British invasion was gathering force, and the most ironic twist of all was that young British bands, Beatles, Stones, were lifting Barry's own songs back into the charts, reviving the sound he had invented while the system had caged him. On the day the courtroom doors closed behind him, the atmosphere around him changed. Fame is noisy. Prosecution is quiet. In that quiet, Barry had to watch strangers interpret his life through legal language, as if a man could be translated into statutes. Reporters waited outside like hunters. Fans argued in kitchens. Moralists nodded as if a guitar solo had somehow been the prelude to a verdict. When the first conviction was overturned because the judge's behavior was cited as racist, it did not feel like absolution. It felt like another reminder that even the process was contaminated. The second trial returned him to the same trap, just with cleaner paperwork. Prison reduces a person to routine. Lights out, count, meal. Silence. Barry later wrote about the fall in his own words. Down from stardom, then I fell to this lowly prison cell. It reads like a lyric because he could not help writing his life in rhyme. But it also reads like an autopsy of the American dream. How many songs can a man write about freedom while living behind a locked door? Barry returned to recording and touring, and he still managed hits. Nadine, and You Never Can Tell. But the momentum of the 1950s was gone. Fame in America can survive prison. It rarely survives the narrative the prison creates. From that point forward, Barry would live with a double identity, the architect of rock and roll, and the man with a record, the legend and the file. The law did not stop visiting. In the late 1970s, he faced tax troubles and served time again. A reminder that the system has many ways to reclaim what it believes you owe. In the 1990s, another wave of allegations surfaced. Women and employees claimed that their privacy had been violated at one of his restaurants, and lawsuits followed. Barry denied wrongdoing, but the suits ended in a settlement measured in millions, the kind of money that feels less like compensation and more like a permanent stain. And then there were the quieter, less measurable costs, the way each scandal edits the public memory of the music. Every time someone praises Johnny B. Goode, someone else remembers the mugshot stories. Every time a filmmaker uses You Never Can Tell as a playful dance moment, someone else wonders what the man behind the riff was doing when no one was watching. Is it possible for a culture to hold greatness and wrongdoing in the same hand without dropping one? Or do we instinctively simplify, turning humans into either saints or monsters because complexity is harder to sell? Barry's genius was about control, the tightness of his guitar lines, the precision of his rhyme, the way he could make chaos sound inevitable. But his life kept demonstrating how fragile control can be. A single legal case can rearrange decades. A single allegation can rewrite a legacy in a weekend. There is another layer too, one that makes his story even darker. Because for black men in America, the line between genuine accountability and public spectacle has often been blurred. The Mann Act itself had been used historically in ways tainted by racism. So when Barry's name appeared in court documents, Was the country witnessing justice, or theater, or both? And if it was both, does that change the weight of what he did, or only the way the system chose to display him? In interviews later in life, Barry could sound weary about the cycle. At times, he acknowledged mistakes with a bluntness that sounded almost like resignation. The road, he seemed to admit, had always contained traps. But there is a difference between knowing a trap exists and stepping into it again. Did he sabotage himself? Did he believe he was untouchable because his music had become too important? Or was he simply a man with appetites and blind spots? No better and no worse than many who never had microphones aimed at them. The myth of rock and roll loves the idea of rebellion. It rarely includes the paperwork that rebellion produces. Yet Barry's life is a reminder that the law is piece of the American road story too. Every highway has exits, every neon-lit night has a morning, and every legend, no matter how loud the amplifiers, eventually has to answer questions in a quiet room. After the prison years, Chuck Berry did what many people do when they survive a public fall. He built a life designed to minimize vulnerability. He still loved the stage, but he loved control more. The industry had shown him how easily it could devour a man and move on. So he became the kind of artist who traveled light, sometimes alone, sometimes with only a guitar and the expectation that a local band would be waiting. Promoters learned quickly that Barry was not sentimental about the business. He wanted his money, often in cash, before he played. He wanted the terms clear. He wanted no surprises, because surprises had already cost him enough. He would count the bills with the calm of a man who had learned that applause does not settle accounts. Then he would wipe his hands, lift the guitar, and step into the lights as if none of it mattered. Freedom, tonight, was scheduled and prepaid. Musicians who backed him for a night often described the same ritual. No rehearsal, a quick handshake, a key change at the last second, a tempo that could suddenly lurch forward. Some thought he was testing them. Some thought he was punishing them. Others suspected it was simpler. Barry refused to let anyone feel too comfortable around his catalog. Comfort breeds entitlement, and entitlement breeds theft. If the band had to wing it, as one famous collaborator once shrugged, then the song stayed dangerous, and danger kept it his. To some, this made him difficult. To others, it made him practical. For a black pioneer who had watched contracts and courts rearrange his life, practicality could be a form of self-defense. Still, there was a loneliness embedded in that method. If you constantly expect betrayal, you also prevent intimacy. If you keep everyone at arm's length, who gets to stand close when the music stops? On stage, he could still summon the old electricity. The riffs remained sharp. The smile remained. The duck walk remained like a signature stamped onto time. But the mythology of the early years, those teenage screams, that sense of invention, was replaced by a different kind of performance. The performance of endurance. Barry became an artist who outlived his own revolution. In the 1980s, the world began formalizing what it had always felt. He was foundational. Awards arrived, tributes arrived. In 1986, he was among the first inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, as if the institution itself needed to begin with him. In 1987, a documentary captured his 60th birthday concerts and rehearsals. Hail, hail, rock and roll, bringing the legend into close-up. The film is fascinating not only because of the music, but because it reveals the tension between Barry and the people who adored him. Keith Richards, a disciple, appears both reverent and exasperated as Barry shifts tempos, changes keys, disrupts rehearsals. Some viewers see it as ego, Others see it as a man refusing to surrender the last territory he owns, his songs, his versions, his authority. In rehearsal rooms, that need for control could turn sharp. There is footage of him drilling famous admirers, Keith Richards included, until the song returned to the exact shape Barry wanted. Once, when Richards reached for Barry's guitar while he was out of the room, Barry came back and snapped, "No one touches my guitar." A sentence that sounds petty until you hear what it really contains. A lifetime of watching other hands profit from your language. Is that what happens when you become the father of a genre? Do you start guarding it like property, afraid that even love can become a kind of theft? In the same era, Barry published an autobiography, presenting his own narrative in a voice that sometimes sounded proud and sometimes sounded defensive. He acknowledged, at least in peace, that every 15 years he seemed to make a major mistake. The line lands like a grim joke. It also suggests a man aware of his own pattern and unsure how to break it. Meanwhile, the world kept borrowing. The Beach Boys built Surfin' You So on the melody of Sweet Little 16, and the dispute over credit became another reminder that influence is not always rewarded fairly. John Lennon was sued over similarities between Come Together and Barry's You Can't Catch Me, and the settlement required Lennon to record Barry's song. For Barry, these episodes were proof that his language had become so dominant that others could speak it without even noticing they were quoting him. What does that do to a creator? Does it inflate the ego? Or does it deepen the paranoia? If your fingerprints are everywhere, does that make you feel immortal or invisible? There were also disputes closer to home. His longtime pianist, Johnny Johnson, sued him in 2000 over songwriting credit and royalties. Arguing that his contributions had been essential, the case was dismissed, but it reopened an uncomfortable question. In the myth of Barry as the solitary genius, how many collaborators disappear? How many arrangements? How many musical decisions made the records what they were, without ever making it into the headline? Barry's life after the storm was not a clean redemption arc. It was an ongoing negotiation. He performed, he traveled, he maintained a residency in St. Louis at a club called Blueberry Hill, showing up month after month like a living ritual. Fans came not only to hear the songs, but to witness continuity in a culture that burns through idols quickly. Barry's continued presence felt like proof that something permanent still existed. He couldn't rewrite every headline, so he kept rewriting the only thing he still owned, the next bar of music. If the world would not forgive him, he would at least stay the author of the tempo, the key, the moment the chorus hit. But permanence has a cost. When you are a legend, you are expected to perform the legend. You are expected to be Chuck Berry every time you walk onto a stage, even when you are tired, even when your hands ache, even when the world's questions have never stopped. Can anyone truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments when the brightest moments keep being replayed in public? Looped like an old jukebox selection. Barry kept playing, he kept smiling, he kept controlling the beat, and beneath all that the same tension hummed. The man who wrote freedom songs was still negotiating with captivity, sometimes literal, sometimes cultural, sometimes self-made. Old age did not soften Chuck Berry into sweetness. It sharpened the contrast between the myth and the man. In photographs from his later years, he often looks amused by the world's insistence on worship. The grin is still there, but it carries a subtext. You don't survive this long without learning how to laugh at the people who think they know you. In St. Louis, he became a local constant. Older fans described those nights as pilgrimage. Younger musicians treated them as school. They came not only to hear the hits, but to watch the mechanics. The way he cued a break with a tilt of his head. The way he stretched a phrase just to see if the band would follow. The way he could turn a familiar song into a small test of loyalty. In a world obsessed with curated perfection, Barry still believed in the rough truth of live sound. Month after month, he returned to the stage at Blueberry Hill, playing with the same tight band that included his children. The setting was smaller than arenas, but that was piece of the point. There is a kind of dignity in refusing to be only a museum exhibit. In those club shows, he could still surprise the room, an extra bar here, a sharper bend there, reminding everyone that the legend was not just a story. It was a living musician. The city honored him with a statue in the Del Mar Loop, an 8-foot image of motion-captured mid-duck walk. A bronze Barry, forever stepping forward. It is a beautiful tribute, and also a strange one. Statues freeze a person in a single gesture. They select one moment and declare it permanent. Was that what Barry wanted, to be preserved as a pose? Or did he want the world to remember that he was always more complicated than a silhouette with a guitar? In October 2016, on his 90th birthday, Barry announced something that sounded like both gift and farewell, a new studio album, his first in decades. He called it Chuck. The title alone felt like a final act of ownership. No character, no teenager, no mythology, just his name, plain and unmasked. He dedicated it to Toddy, the wife who had been beside him through the long, jagged road. He joked that after finishing the record, he could finally hang up his shoes. It was the kind of line that lands like humor until you realize it is also a man acknowledging fatigue. The album had been worked on for years, across decades, through fires and setbacks, recorded in fragments, stitched together with persistence. His son played guitar. His daughter played harmonica. Family became the frame around the final statement, as if Barry wanted the last chapter to belong to the people who knew him beyond the stage. Were these late choices acts of surrender, or were they courageous acts of self-preservation? Was Chuck Berry retreating into family because the world had grown too loud, or because he finally learned where the real audience lived? Even in those years, the controversies did not evaporate. They lingered in articles, in whispered arguments, in the uneasy footnotes that follow certain names. Barry lived with that too. Perhaps he understood that America does not grant clean endings, especially not to black men who become too large in the public imagination. People who saw him late in life sometimes noticed how the songs had become almost architectural. He didn't rush. He didn't perform like someone pleading to be loved. He performed like someone proving a point. The foundation still holds. And when he spoke to audiences, he could be curt, funny, occasionally warm, occasionally sharp. He never behaved like a man grateful for approval. Approval is fickle. He had learned that early. At home, the myth of endless motion met the reality of age. The hands that had written riffs now carried the slow weight of years. The body that had duck-walked across stages now navigated ordinary rooms. Yet the mind, by all accounts, kept returning to the same obsessions. Rhythm, punchline, the bite of a lyric. The road had been his great theme. But perhaps the real theme was work. Work as survival. Work as identity. Work as the one place where he could still set the rules. And if the world continued to freeze him into that duck walk pose, maybe the album Chuck was his last attempt to thaw the statue from the inside. Still, he kept playing. He kept smiling that half-challenging smile. He kept walking on stage like the road belonged to him, even as time made the road shorter, and somewhere in the quiet between shows, the question remained. When you spend a lifetime being called a legend, do you ever get to be simply human again? After the announcement of Chuck, time tightened. The world waited for the record like it was waiting for a final verdict. Some fans wanted redemption. Some wanted nostalgia. Some wanted proof that the legend still had new sentences to teach. Barry, meanwhile, was simply finishing his work. The album would be released in June 2017, but he would not live to see it arrive on shelves. The road, at last, ended first. Ended. On March 18, 2017, the news traveled faster than any tour bus ever could. Chuck Berry dead at 90, a headline that tries to compress a century into a single line. In St. Charles County, Missouri, emergency responders could not revive him. The official statements were brief. The public response was thunderous. Tributes came from every direction: musicians, presidents, cultural institutions, teenagers discovering him for the first time through a viral clip. In a way, the world performed its own ritual, repeating the songs as if repetition could resurrect the man. Then came the funeral, held in St. Louis at the pageant, with a public visitation that felt like a civic event. People lined up to see the body of the man who had once been too alive to fit inside any room. Reports described him dressed in a suit, a cherry-red Gibson guitar placed like a final emblem, flowers shaped like guitars, eulogies from famous admirers. Even in death, the myth insisted on staging itself. And then, in June, the album arrived. Chuck sounded like a late-life postcard from a man who had spent decades refusing to disappear. The songs carried humor, grit, and the stubborn simplicity he always defended. It was not the sound of a man trying to reinvent himself. It was the sound of a man signing his name one last time. Still, the legacy is not a clean monument. It never was. On the bright side of the ledger, Barry's influence is nearly impossible to measure. He fused blues with country, turned swing into backbeat, and wrote lyrics that gave rock its narrative spine. He taught the genre how to tell stories instead of merely shouting feelings. He created a vocabulary, riffs as verbs, punchlines as punctuation, the guitar as a narrator with a sly grin. Without him, the Beatles would have spoken a different dialect. The Stones would have walked a different road. The very image of a rock guitarist, legs apart, body leaning forward, sound driving like a car, would be missing its blueprint. And then there is the cosmic irony. Johnny B. Goode traveling through deep space on Voyager, carrying Barry's sound into an emptiness that has never heard prejudice, never written a law, never demanded a clean story. If aliens ever find that record, what will they think? Will they hear joy? Will they hear rebellion? Will they hear the complicated biography hiding beneath a 2-minute guitar intro? On the darker side of the ledger, Barry's life forces a more uncomfortable conversation. The legal cases were not footnotes, they were recurring collisions. The Mann Act prosecution in the early 1960s put him in federal prison for nearly 2 years. Years later came tax evasion, and another sentence that turned a cultural architect into an inmate again. Decades after that, allegations and civil lawsuits tied to hidden cameras at his Missouri restaurant added yet another bruise to the legend. Events that some fans tried to minimize, others refused to ignore, and nearly everyone argued about. These are not decorative shadows. The question is not whether they existed, but what a culture does with them. Do we separate the art from the artist because we want the songs to remain usable? Or do we refuse separation because we believe genius cannot be allowed to launder wrongdoing? Some people called him the poet laureate of rock and roll, and the phrase fits because his gift was not only musical, it was literary. He knew how to turn a street corner into a plot, how to turn a car ride into a metaphor, how to make a joke land like a prophecy. He even received honors that recognized that lyric craft. As if institutions were finally admitting what teenagers had known all along. These were stories, not just songs. Perhaps that is the true price of being a living legend. You become a symbol that cannot be edited cleanly. Your life becomes a debate. Your songs become evidence. In the end, even the riffs become exhibits, played again and again, while the verdict stays complicated. A phone speaker crackles. The chorus of a familiar song lifts, bright and easy, and the room fills with a freedom that feels borrowed. Somewhere behind that brightness. A man from St. Louis is still trying to be heard, not only as a legend, but as a life. A gavel falls somewhere in memory. Then the opening lick starts again, bright, fast, irresistible, as if the music is trying to outrun the file. It never does. It only makes the chase feel exhilarating. And yet people keep returning. Because in the first seconds of a Chuck Berry song, the world feels younger, faster, less afraid. He built that sensation so well that it outlived him. And it keeps tempting listeners to treat the sensation as a full biography. When we call him the father of rock, are we honoring him, or turning a living, flawed man into a statue so we don't have to hold the contradictions? If his songs taught the world freedom, why does his story read like a ledger of control? And what does that say about the kind of freedom America actually sells? His music will keep traveling, through radios, through films, through garages, through the hands of teenagers learning their first power chord. The road he drew is still there, neon and dangerous. The question is whether the next time those riffs lift the room, anyone will listen for the shadow behind the brightness, and admit that the language of youth was invented by a man who could never fully escape the law that judged him.